How juicy will the UFC be without USADA? You've probably heard that the UFC is severing its relationship with USADA starting on January 1st of 2024. Their breakup is a lot like mine and my previous exes, ending with both of us wanting different things and one of us being fed up with the question, are you clean? While the UFC does claim that it has plans to make their drug program better than ever and more rigorous than ever, there are a lot of critics out there, including fighters. And many of those critics have suggested that this is the start of the steroid era or the restart, depending on how you look at it. Just for the sake of this video, let's assume that the skeptics are onto something here. What would a new, much more roided UFC landscape look like, and what are the pros and cons of that? Fortunately for you and I, a quick peek into the past may give us a glimpse of what the future looks like, which is why I'm taking you on a journey to a magical time before rigorous steroid testing. That's right, we're going to the early 2000s when looking thick, solid, and tight wasn't just part of the job description, it was a goddamn requirement. Not much else to say other than let's go. Welcome to the early 2000s, boys and girls. I must say, it feels pretty good to be back in my affliction gear. And I know you won't believe me, but this is a medium-sized t-shirt. Anyways, back to this trip. I've already planned the whole thing out and I've got some pre-planned stops along the way. First thing on the agenda is checking out the physical differences between fighters today compared to the old days. Obviously, we have guys in the UFC today who have incredible physiques. Paulo Costa looks like Brazilian Clark Kent. Aljo gets more peeled than a Julian salad. And if I even start talking about Cyril Gane, I'm gonna have to stop this video because I'll be too aroused to continue. Now, if we compare that to the pre-USADA days, it's just not even close. There were mass monsters in every single division, and it was just much more common to look freaky deaky, for lack of a better term. Oh, Troy, you sure do think about men's physiques a lot. And let me tell you something about that. A wise man once said, it's not gay if it's MMA. I am the wise man, and I once said that, and I just said it again. Now let's bring it back to the point at hand. To illustrate how different these guys look compared to today, let's look at some notable fighters from that era. You all already know about Uberim, TRT Vitor, and Brock Lesnar, so I'm not gonna talk about them. I'm going to talk about some guys that don't get enough love today. And just one disclaimer before we do get started, just because I didn't want to have any sort of debate where people are saying, oh no, that guy's for sure natty. We're only going to look at guys that either admitted that they were on steroids or failed a drug test. First, off the top of my head, I just want to start with Sherk. At first glance, you might be thinking, why does this guy look like some sort of fucking muscle hamster? One, because he is sort of a muscle hamster. And two, he popped dirty for nandrolone, which is a very common anabolic steroid that's used in bodybuilding and for performance enhancement. So it does stand to reason that when you combine a 5'6" frame, superior genetics, and a lot of steroids, you probably end up coming out looking very muscle hamsterish. Funny enough, his nickname was actually Muscle Shark, which is 10 times cooler than Muscle Hamster, and it's very fitting because the man is juiced to the gills. Now, Sean made his UFC debut in 2001, and he fought in the UFC all the way until 2011. Despite being the same height as Alexander Volkanovski, not only did he become a champion at lightweight, but he spent a good portion of his career fighting at welterweight, which is obviously pretty incredible when you consider his stature. Let's put that in perspective for just a second. Volk is for sure an imposing featherweight, and he was 225 pounds at one point when he played rugby, but at no point did he ever look anywhere close to being this yoked. Moving on to another man from this era who had his PhD in juiciness as well, but not only that, he's a former UFC champion, and he was one of the very first people to ever be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Some of you already may have guessed, but I'm talking about the great Ken Shamrock. At his peak, Ken looked like what any 10-year-old would do when they did their very first creative character in any game, which is turn up every single muscle slider available to make them look like they stepped straight out of the Dragon Ball Z universe. Like Sean Sherk, he too was suspended for PED usage in 2009, which was pretty late in his career when he was fighting for a promotion called War Gods. And yes, that was a real promotion. Not only that, but he has admitted to his own usage, well, sort of. And what I mean by sort of is that he's admitted fully to using steroids in his career, but he simultaneously says that he was 100% natural every time he stepped into the ring. And from everything I've gathered, what he did mean by that was that he would taper off steroids leading up to competition. So in his mind, he was all natty, which would be like me being on steroids and saying I'm all natural because I didn't show up to the weigh-ins with a steroid needle literally in my ass. Now, putting that aside, Ken's actually been very vocal about how rampant steroid usage was in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and he was one of the few fighters that were telling fighting organizations to do everything they could to prevent young athletes from ever starting on anabolics in the first place. Regardless of his steroid usage, I think we all can agree he's a legend in the sport, but I think we can all also agree that nobody in today's UFC walks around looking anywhere close to what he did. The contrast is once again undeniable. Before we do move on to the pros and cons I've put together, I just want to make one more pit stop along the way because I don't think this journey would be complete if we didn't go to the early 2000s to talk about another former UFC champion who was the absolute dictionary definition of juicy. And I'm talking about Kevin Randleman. Kevin had a short stint in the UFC from 1999 to 2002, but that's not to say that his time in the UFC wasn't impactful. He won the UFC heavyweight title, which is obviously impressive by itself, but when you realize that Kevin's 5'10", it becomes even that much more impressive. I mean, just look at this guy. He's built like a literal shit brick house. Whoever wondered what DC might have looked like if he would have shed a few pounds and then replaced those few pounds with pounds of steroids directly into his veins, well, maybe Kevin Randleman's what you get out of that. The man was an absolute specimen, and I know I've said it multiple times in this video already, but I just want to hammer home that nobody in the USADA era looks anywhere close to what this man does. Kevin never truly admitted to being on steroids, but he had an interview in 2011 where he alluded to a lot of things that sounded exactly like steroids. To me, at least, it sounded like he didn't want to put anyone else on blast, which is, obviously honorable. In that interview in 2011, he alluded to him having to take a lot of things to keep weight on because it's not natural for someone of his stature to be 225 pounds, jacked and shredded all the time. And he said that the things that he did take likely hurt the longevity of his career and his health, which obviously led many to believe that he was saying that he used PEDs without actually explicitly saying. Like the other two that we already talked about, he too was suspended in 2006 by Pride because he submitted a fake urine sample. Many of you probably already know, but Pride was notorious for its lack of steroid testing, and many fighters who did fight in Pride have come out now and said that steroid use was obviously rampant. Pains me to say, but unfortunately, Kevin did pass away in 2016 at the age of 44. He came down with pneumonia, which eventually led to heart failure. And some have speculated that steroid usage could have definitely contributed to dying of heart failure at such a young age. Now, the opening question to this video was how juicy will the UFC be without USADA? And based on what we've seen so far, I think the answer is obviously juicier than Tropicana. And if these three guys weren't enough for you, I implore you to go take a look at some highlights from the pre-USADA days in the UFC and just look at the physical difference between then compared to now. And if even that isn't enough, go take a look at some Pride highlights from the 1990s when they didn't test at all. Now back to the topic at hand, which is envisioning a juicier UFC. When it comes to that, we can't just think about looks. There are obviously a lot more things that come with no testing or less rigorous testing overall, and now we're going to discuss the pros and cons of that. Let's just start at the top with the pros. I've seen notable athletes, including Gordon Ryan, the Natty King himself, say that allowing athletes to use steroids and not testing at all is going to lead to happier, healthier athletes with longer careers. And if that's true, we can definitely chalk that up as a pro. Looking back at the early 2000s when I watch highlights and when I just look at career arcs, I get the feeling that older fighters tended to perform at a higher level for longer. And that definitely could be attributed to more lax steroid testing. But I'm not 100% sure on that because I couldn't really find any good data to back that up. So if there's anyone in the comments who does know better than me, please feel free to correct me. Now let's move on to another pro that I've seen a good amount of people talk about, and that is that less testing or no testing at all would actually create a fair playing field. As it stands right now, when there is drug testing in a sport, honest athletes won't even consider cheating because, well, they're honest athletes no matter the competitive advantage. Which does open the door to what a lot of people think we have with USADA right now, which is just a contest to see who can cheat the best. No matter how rigorous the testing, the unfortunate truth is that there's always going to be people that get past it. For example, Lance Armstrong did it and he was the most tested man in the world. And then if we go even further than that, the Russians did it in the Olympics for over 40 years because of the lengths that they were willing to go to escape testing. So in that aspect, I definitely get it. If you took away testing, athletes would just use openly and everybody can use whatever they want. And I guess athletes that are uncomfortable with that would need to go find an organization that does test for steroids, very similar to bodybuilding, how they have tested and untested federations. Lastly, I've seen a lot of people discuss this as well. Another potential pro could be the entertainment factor. In 2012, former UFC fighter Phil Baroni said, "I don't want to see who's the best at passing a drug test. I want to see the baddest MFers going at it." Phil was also suspended for using steroids during his career, so maybe not the most unbiased opinion, but an honest opinion nonetheless. Many, including myself, agree that the bigger, stronger, and girthier athletes are, the more likely that the end product will be more entertaining. Watching a bunch of guys that look like they took the super soldier serum straight to the dome, try and knock each other out at the speed of light, does sound like a pretty good product to me. All right, so far we've explored some potential pros, but it's obvious that we have to go back and look at the potential drawbacks or the cons of what less testing or no testing means. Let's go all the way back to that first pro that I talked about, where Gordon Ryan said that no testing is going to allow for healthier, happier athletes that have longer careers. His point about athletes having careers that are longer than a Lord of the Rings movie may actually do the exact opposite when it comes to health. I mean, just think about it. The longer you compete in a sport as violent as this one, the more damage you're going to take. And most of these fighters have problems retiring as is. Usually, their body breaking down and forcing them into retirement is the only thing stopping them from taking additional damage. I'm no physicist, but I'm pretty sure everybody learns in Physics 101 that more roids equals more mass, and more mass equals more force, and more force equals more CTE. But don't quote me on that. And to top that entire thing off, anyone who knows anything about performance-enhancing drugs agrees that there are a lot of drawbacks. It's not like you can take these things and not have any side effects at all. Just ask anyone who's a fan of bodybuilding how many of their favorite bodybuilders have dropped dead at an early age or have had lifelong complications due to manipulating their hormones. Continuing on our path down the cons, let's just hit another one. The idea that less testing could be more fair because it's an even playing field to use whatever you want definitely has merit. But I think what could happen is just an arms race to see who could get the most stuff or the best stuff. And because MMA is a worldwide sport, everybody comes from a different economic background and a different place with different laws and regulations. Someone from the favelas in Brazil probably isn't going to have the same level of access to PEDs as someone from a wealthier background. And at least here in the US, steroids are illegal, so many of your favorite athletes would likely be getting their stuff from a guy named Larry who brewed it in his bathtub. There is definitely a huge element of unfairness in testing, in that the honest guys will never cheat, and the guys who are good at cheating get around the system. But I will say there is a massive disincentive to risking cheating, which is jeopardizing your entire career, which for a good majority of guys is enough to stay away for good. Last but not least, let's move on to the final con I wanted to talk about, which, if you've guessed the theme by now, is going to be a counter argument to a possible pro from before, which is the entertainment factor. Like I said, I won't debate that being bigger, faster, and stronger likely leads to a more entertaining product. But I think people would be lying to themselves if they think that the majority of the population is going to be okay knowing that athletes are using steroids or any substance that boosts their performance outside of what they're naturally born with. People love sports because it's the ultimate culmination of competition. All you have is what you're born with and the skills that you work to achieve. And for better or for worse, there's just a massive stigma around PEDs in general, and most people relate it to cheating. While it could lead to a more entertaining product, and I think Pride in the early days shows that it was a very entertaining product, fans actively knowing that there's an open steroid policy would likely be such a massive turnoff that a lot of people wouldn't watch the sport to begin with. And unfortunately, no amount of additional entertainment is going to convince them otherwise. And I think here in the US at least, most people would likely fall into that bucket. We went back in time and looked at some juicy fighters. We talked about some pros, we talked about some cons, and it's time to circle back to that initial question just one last time, which is, how juicy will the UFC be without USADA? And the truth is, we just don't know. The unfortunate truth is, only time will tell. USADA has definitely been made out to be the bad guy as of late, but since they partnered with the UFC in 2015, I think that they've done a lot more good than bad. Obviously, waking guys up in the middle of the night to get a urine sample, or waiting until guys are cutting for their fight to get a blood sample is obviously horrible. But outside of that, they did exactly what they were put there to do, which is provide the most rigorous testing in all of sports. and I do truly believe that most fighters thank them for that. As we've already talked about at length, if you just take a look at life before USADA, there was an obvious and apparent physical change in how fighters looked. Henry Cejudo said himself after being in both Olympic level drug testing and the UFC's drug program that the UFC's drug program was far and away better at catching cheaters because of the randomness and how often they tested. And he also went on to say that as an honest athlete, that's what you should want, despite the annoyances. Furthermore, I think USADA did a really good job of being a counterbalance to the UFC when it came to having just as much power over the athletes as the UFC did. And if you truly do want high-level testing that's unbiased and fair and can't be influenced by the outside, I think that is exactly what you want. It sounds like the UFC was doing everything they could to try and pressure USADA to let Conor fight before he completed his 6 months in the testing pool. But they couldn't because USADA had just as much power as they did to say no. I love the UFC with all my heart. I can't state that enough. So this isn't a shot at them at all. But they have a clear financial incentive to keep their best fighters fighting so that they can keep making money whether they're on drugs or not. Which I totally understand, by the way. Business is business and that is their job. But that doesn't keep athletes' safety at the forefront to prevent fighters who may or may not be on steroids from fighting fighters who are honest and not on anything at all. That's the drug testing organization's job, to keep the fighters safe and make sure that everything is a level playing field or as close to as humanly possible as it could be. I'll personally always believe that more rigorous testing and a very strict drug program is going to be better for the UFC long term and the athletes long term. Even though we couldn't answer the question that originally started the video, you might be thinking, what was the entire point of this? And I'd be lying if I didn't say that part of the goal of this video was to just travel back in time and really reminisce and gawk at the Pride days and the pre-USADA days. And to our credit, we did do just that. And I don't know about you, but I did have fun. And who knows? Without USADA being around, maybe our juiciest days are ahead rather than behind us.